The Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam by Dr. Muhammad Iqbal. Lecture 3, The Conception of God and the Meaning of Prayer. The following passage from Professor Rogier's Philosophy and New Physics is noteworthy in this connection. Contrary to the ancient adage, natura non facit saltus, it becomes apparent that the universe varies by sudden jumps and not by imperceptible degrees. A physical system is capable of only a finite number of distinct states. Since between two different and immediate consecutive states the world remains motionless, time is suspended, so that time itself is discontinuous. There is an atom of time. The point, however, is that the constructive endeavor of the Asharite, as of the moderns, was wholly lacking in psychological analysis, and the result of this shortcoming was that they altogether failed to perceive the subjective aspect of time. It is due to this failure that in their theory, the systems of material atoms and time atoms lie apart, with no organic relation between them. It is clear that if we look at time from a purely objective point of view, serious difficulties arise, for we cannot apply atomic time to God and conceive him as a life in the making, as Professor Alexander appears to have done in his lectures on space, time, and deity. Later Muslim theologians fully realized these difficulties. Mullah Jalaluddin Dawani, in a passage of his Zohra, reminds the modern student of Professor Royce's view of time, tells us that if we take time to be a kind of span which makes possible the appearance of events as a moving procession and conceive this span to be a unity, then we cannot but describe it as an original state of divine activity, encompassing all the succeeding states of that activity. But the mullah takes good care to add that a deeper insight into the nature of succession reveals its relativity, so that it disappears in the case of God, to whom all events are present in a single act of perception. The Sufi poet Haqi has a similar way of looking at the matter. He conceives the infinite varieties of time relative to the varying grades of being, intervening between materiality and pure spirituality. The time of gross bodies, which arises from the revolution of the heavens, is divisible into past, present, and future, and its nature is such that as long as one day does not pass away, the succeeding day does not come. The time of immaterial beings is also serial in character, but its passage is such that a whole year in the time of gross bodies is not more than a day in the time of an immaterial being. Rising higher and higher in the scale of immaterial beings, we reach divine time, time which is absolutely free from the quality of passage and consequently does not admit of divisibility, sequence, and change. It is above eternity. It has neither beginning nor end. The eye of God sees all the visibles, and his ears hears all the audibles in one indivisible act of perception. The priority of God is not due to the priority of time. On the other hand, the priority of time is due to God's priority. Thus, divine time is what the Quran describes as the mother of books, in which the whole history, freed from the net of causal sequence, is gathered up in a single super-eternal now. Of all the Muslim theologians, however, it is Fakhruddin Razi who appears to have given his most serious attention to the problem of time. In his Eastern discussions, Razi subjects to a searching examination all contemporary theories of time. He too is, in the main, objective in his method and finds himself unable to reach any definite conclusions. Until now, he says, I have not been able to discover anything really true with regard to the nature of time, and the main purpose of my book is to explain what can possibly be said for or against each theory without any spirit of partisanship, which I generally avoid, especially in connection with the problem of time. The above discussion makes it perfectly clear that a purely objective point of view is only partially helpful in our understanding of the nature of time. The right course is careful psychological analysis of our conscious experience, which alone reveals the true nature of time. I suppose you remember the distinction that I drew in the two aspects of the self, appreciative and efficient. The appreciative self lives in pure duration, that is, change without succession. The life of the self consists in its movement from appreciation to efficiency, from intuition to intellect, and atomic time is born out of this movement. Thus, the character of our conscious experience, our point of departure in all knowledge, gives us a clue to the concept which reconciles the opposition of permanence and change, of time regarded as an organic whole or eternity, and time regarded as atomic. If then we accept the guidance of our conscious experience and conceive the life of all inclusive ego on the analogy of the finite ego, the time of the ultimate ego is revealed as change without succession, that is, an organic whole which appears atomic because of the creative movement of the ego. This is what Damad and Mullah Bakir mean when they say that time is born with the act of creation by which the ultimate ego realizes and measures, so to speak, the infinite wealth of his own undetermined creative possibilities. On the one hand, therefore, the ego lives in eternity, by which term I mean non successional change. On the other hand, it lives in serial time, which I conceive as organically related to eternity in the sense that it is a measure of non successional change. In this sense alone, it is possible to understand the Quranic verse, to God belongs the alternation of the day and night. But on this difficult side of the problem, I have said enough in my preceding lecture. It is now time to pass on to the divine attributes of knowledge and omnipotence. The word knowledge, as applied to the finite ego, always means discursive knowledge, a temporal process which moves round a vertible other, supposed to exist per se and confronting the knowing ego. In this sense, knowledge, even if we extend it to the point of omniscience, must always remain relative to its confronting other and therefore cannot be predicated of the ultimate ego who, being all inclusive, cannot be conceived as having a perspective like the finite ego. The universe, as we have seen before, is not an other existing per se in opposition to God. It is only when we look at the act of creation as a specific event in the life history of God that the universe appears as an independent other. From the standpoint of all inclusive ego, there is no other. In him, thought and deed, the act of knowing and the act of creating, are identical. It may be argued that the ego, whether finite or infinite, is inconceivable without a confronting non ego. And if there is nothing outside the ultimate ego cannot be conceived as an ego. The answer to this argument is that logical negations are of no use in forming a positive concept which must be based on the character of reality as revealed in experience. Our criticism of experience reveals the ultimate reality to be a rationally directed life, which, in the view of our experience of life, cannot be conceived except as organic whole, a something closely knit together and possessing a central point of reference. This being the character of life, the ultimate life can be conceived only as an ego. Knowledge, in the sense of discursive knowledge, however infinite, cannot therefore be predicated of an ego who knows and at the same time forms the ground of the object known. Unfortunately, language does not help us here. We possess no word to express the kind of knowledge which is also creative of its object. The alternative concept of divine knowledge is omniscience, is in the sense of a single indivisible act of perception which makes God immediately aware of the entire sweep of history, regarded as an order of specific events in an eternal now. This is how Jalaluddin Dawani, Iraqi, and Professor Royce in our own times conceived God's knowledge. There is an element of truth in this conception, but it suggests a closed universe, a fixed futurity, a predetermined, unalterable order of specific events which, like a superior fate, has once for all determined and directions of God's creative activity. In fact, divine knowledge, regarded as a kind of passive omniscience, is nothing more than an inert void of pre Einsteinian physics, which confers a semblance of unity on things by holding them together, a sort of mirror passively reflecting the details of an already finished structure of things, which the finite consciousness reflects in fragments only. Divine knowledge must be conceived as a living creative activity to which the objects that appear to exist in their own right are organically related. By conceiving God's knowledge as a kind of reflecting mirror, we no doubt save his foreknowledge of future events. But it is obvious that we do not do so at the expense of his freedom. The future certainly pre exists in the organic whole of God's creative life, but it pre exists as an open possibility, not as a fixed order of events with definite outlines. An illustration will perhaps help us in understanding what I mean. Suppose, as sometimes happens in the history of human thought, a fruitful idea with a great inner wealth of applications emerges into the light of your consciousness. You are immediately aware of the idea as a complex whole, but the intellectual working out of its numerous bearings is a matter of time. Intuitively, all the possibilities of the idea are present in your mind. If a specific possibility as such is not intellectually known to you at a certain moment of time, it is not because your knowledge is defective, but because there is yet no possibility to become known. The idea reveals the possibilities of its application with the advancing experience, and sometimes it takes more than a generation of thinkers before these possibilities are exhausted. Nor is it possible on the view of divine knowledge as a kind of passive omniscience to reach the idea of a creator. If history is regarded merely as a gradually revealed photo of a predetermined order of events, then there is no room in it for novelty and initiation. Consequently, we can attach no meaning to the word creation, which has a meaning for us only in the view of our own capacity for original action. The truth is that the whole theological controversy relating to predestination is due to pure speculation with no eye on the spontaneity of life, which is a fact of actual experience. No doubt, the emergence of egos endowed with the power of spontaneous and hence unforeseeable action is, in a sense, a limitation on the freedom of the all inclusive ego. But this limitation is not externally imposed. It is born out of his own creative freedom, whereby he has chosen finite egos to be participators of his life, power, and freedom. But how, it may be asked, it is possible to reconcile limitation with omnipotence? The word limitation need not frighten us. The Quran has no liking for abstract universals. It always fixes its gaze on the concrete, which the theory of relativity has only recently taught modern philosophy to see. All activity, creational or otherwise, is a kind of limitation without which it is impossible to conceive God as a concrete operative ego. Omnipotence, abstractly conceived, is merely a blind, capricious power without limits. The Quran has a clear and definite conception of nature as a cosmos of mutually related forces. It therefore views divine omnipotence as intimately related to divine wisdom and finds the infinite power of God revealed, not in the arbitrary and the capricious, but in the recurrent, the regular, and the orderly. At the same time, the Quran conceives God as holding all goodness in his hands. If then the rationally directed divine will is good, a very serious problem arises. The course of evolution, as revealed by modern science, involves almost universal suffering and wrongdoing. No doubt, wrongdoing is confined to man only, but the fact of pain is almost universal. Thought it equally true that man can suffer and have suffered the most excruciating pain for the sake of what they have believed to be good. Thus, the two facts of moral and physical evil stand out, prominent in the life of nature. Nor can the relativity of evil and the presence of forces that tend to transmute it be a source of consolation to us, for in spite of all this relativity and transmutation, there is something terribly positive about it. How is it then possible to reconcile the goodness and omnipotence of God with the immense volume of evil in His creation? This painful problem is really the crux of theism. No modern writer has put it more accurately than Human in his brief Uber religion. We possess, he says, a knowledge of the world which teaches us a God of power and strength, who sends out life and death as simultaneously as shadow and light, and a revelation, a faith as to the salvation which declares the same God to be Father. The following of the world God produces the morality of struggle for existence, and the service of the Father of Jesus Christ produces the morality of compassion. And yet they are not two gods, but one God. Somehow or the other, their arms intertwine. Only no mortal can say where and how this occurs. To the optimist, Browning, all is well with the world. To the pessimist, Schopenhauer, the world is one perpetual winter wherein a blind will express itself in an infinite variety of living things which bemoan their emergence for a moment and then disappear forever. The issue thus raised between optimism and pessimism cannot be finally decided at the present stage of our knowledge of the universe. Our intellectual constitution is such that we can take only a piecemeal view of things. We cannot understand the full import of the great cosmic forces which work havoc and at the same time sustain and amplify life. The teaching of the Quran, which believes in the possibility of improvement in the behavior of man and has his control over natural forces, is neither optimism nor pessimism. It is meliorism, which recognizes a growing universe and is animated by the hope of man's eventual victory over evil. But the clue to a better understanding of our difficulty is given in the legend relating to what is called the fall of man. In this legend, the Quran partly retains the ancient symbols, but the legend is materially transformed with a view to put an entirely fresh meaning into it. the Quranic method of complete or partial transformation of legends in order to dissolve them with new ideas and thus to adapt them to the advancing spirit of time is an important point which has nearly always been overlooked both by Muslim and non Muslim students of Islam. The object of the Quran in dealing with these legends is seldom historical. It nearly always aims at giving them a universal moral or philosophical import, and it achieves this object by omitting the names of persons and localities which tend to limit the meaning of a legend by giving it the color of a specific historical event, and also by deleting details which appear to belong to a different order of feeling. This is not an uncommon method of dealing with legends. It is common in non religious literature. An instance in point is the legend of Faust, to which the touch of Goethe's genius has given a wholly new meaning. Turning to the legend of the fall, we find it in a variety of forms in the literatures of the ancient world. It is indeed impossible to demarcate the stages of its growth and to set out clearly the various human motives which must have worked in its slow transformation. But confining ourselves to the Semitic form of the myth, it is highly probable that it arose out of the primitive man's desire to explain to himself the infinite misery of his plight in an uncongenial environment, which abounded in disease and death and obstructed him on all sides in his endeavor to maintain himself. Having no control over the forces of nature, a pessimistic view of life was perfectly natural to him. Thus, in an old Babylonian inscription, we find the serpent, phallic symbol, the tree and the woman offering an apple, symbol of virginity to the man. The meaning of the myth is clear. The fall of man from a supposed state of bliss was due to the original sexual act of the human pair. The way in which the Quran handles this legend becomes clear when we compare it with the narration of the book of Genesis. The remarkable points of difference between the Quranic and the biblical narrations suggest unmistakably the purpose of the Quranic narration. Number 1. The Quran omits the serpent and the rib story altogether. The former omission is obviously meant to free the story from its phallic setting and its original suggestion of a pessimistic view of life. The latter omission is meant to suggest that the purpose of the Quranic narration is not historical, as in the case of the Old Testament, which gives us an account of the origin of the first man human pair by the way of the prelude to the history of Israel. Indeed, in the verses which deal with the origin of man as a living being, the Quran uses the words bashar or insan, not Adam, which it reserves for man in his capacity of God's vicegerent on earth. The purpose of the Quran is further secured by the omission of proper names mentioned in the biblical narration, Adam and Eve. The word Adam is retained and used more as a concept than as the name of a concrete human individual. This use of the word is not without authority in the Quran itself. The following verse is clear on the point. We created you, then fashioned you, then said, we to the angels, prostrate yourself unto Adam. 7:11. Number 2. The Quran splits up the legend into two distinct episodes, the one relating to what it describes simply as the tree, and the other relating to the tree of eternity and the kingdom that falleth not. The first episode is mentioned in the 7th and the second in the 20th Surah of the Quran. According to the Quran, Adam and his wife, led astray by Satan, whose function is to create doubts in the minds of men, tasted the fruit of both the trees, whereas, according to the Old Testament, man was driven out of the Garden of Eden immediately after his first act of disobedience. And God placed at the eastern side of the garden angels and a flaming sword, turning on all sides to keep the way to the tree of life. Number 3. The Old Testament curses the earth for Adam's act of disobedience. The Quran declares the earth to be the dwelling place of man and a source of profit to him, for the possession of which he ought to be grateful to God. And we have established you on the earth and given you therein the supports of life. How little do ye give thanks? 7:10. Nor is there any reason to suppose that the word Jannat, garden, as used here, means the supersensual paradise from which man is supposed to have fallen on this earth. According to the Quran, man is not a stranger on this earth, and we have caused you to grow from the earth, says the Quran. The Jannat mentioned in the legend cannot mean the eternal abode of the righteous. In the sense of the eternal abode, the righteous, Jannat is described by the Quran to be the place wherein the righteous will pass to one another, the cup which shall engender no light discourse, no motive to sin. It is further described to be the place wherein no weariness shall reach the righteous, nor forth from it shall they be cast. In the Jannat mentioned in the legend, however, the very first event that took place was a man's sin of disobedience followed by his expulsion. In fact, the Quran explains itself the meaning of the word as used in its own narration. The second episode of the legend, the garden, is described as the place where there is neither hunger nor thirst, neither heat nor nakedness. I am therefore inclined to think that the Jannat in the Quranic narration is the conception of a primitive state in which man is practically unrelated to his environment and consequently does not feel the sting of human wants, the birth of which alone marks the beginning of the human culture. Thus, we see that the Quranic legend of the fall has nothing to do with the first appearance of man on this planet. Its purpose is rather to indicate man's rise from a primitive state of instinctive appetite to the conscious possession of a free self, capable of doubt and disobedience. The fall does not mean any moral depravity. It is man's transition from simple consciousness to the first flash of self consciousness, a kind of waking from the dream of nature, with a throb of personal casualty in one's own being. Nor does the Quran regard the earth as a torture hall where an elementally wicked humanity is imprisoned for an original act of sin. Man's first act of disobedience was also his first act of free choice, and that is why, according to the Quranic narration, Adam's first transgression was forgiven. Now, goodness is not a matter of compulsion. It is the self's free surrender to the moral ideal and arises out of a willing cooperation of free egos. A being whose movements are wholly determined like a machine cannot produce goodness. Freedom is thus a condition of goodness, but to permit the emergence of a finite ego who has the power to choose, after considering the relative values of several courses of action open to him, is really to take a great risk. For the freedom to choose good involves also the freedom to choose what is the opposite of good. That God has taken this risk shows his immense faith in man. It is for man now to justify his faith. Perhaps such a risk alone makes it possible to test and develop the potentialities of being a being who was created of the goodliness fabric and then brought down to be the lowest of the low. As the Quran says, "And for trial will we test you with evil and with good." 21:35. Good and evil, therefore, though opposites, must fall within the same whole. There is no such thing as an isolated fact, for facts are symptomatic wholes, the elements of which must be understood by mutual reference. Logical judgment separates the elements of a fact only to reveal their interdependence.